Hello and welcome to another session on criticism and theory. Let's begin. Towards a Feminist Poetics by Elaine Shawwater. Elaine Shawwater is familiar to you. She is, we had studied feminist novelists in women's writing. So the very same person is also a feminist critic, and she has written very seminal essays, and one of which is towards a feminist poetics, which is in fact a very important critical theory or criticism. Elaine Shawwater is an American critic. She's a feminist, and she is also a writer on cultural and social issues. She is one of the founders of feminist literary criticism in United States academia. And she has developed the concept and also has brought in the practice of gynocritics. Now, or gynocriticism, yes. You will be studying about gynocriticism now. She is well known and respected in both academic as well as popular cultural field. She has written and edited numerous books and articles focused on a variety of subjects, from feminist literary criticism to fashion, sometimes sparking widespread controversy also, especially with her work on illness that we did discuss on when we studied or when we took feminist novels. Remember? She has been a television critic for People magazine and also a commentator on BBC radio and television as well. She is a specialist in Victorian literature. Her most innovative work in this field is Madness and Hysteria in Literature, especially in women's writing and the portrayal of female characters. Shawwater's best known works are Toward a Feminist Poetics, published in 1979, The Female Malady, Women, Madness and English Culture, which perhaps was written between 1830 and 1980 and was published in 1985. Histories, Hysterical Epidemics and Modern Media in 1997, and Inventing Herself, Claiming a Feminist Intellectual Heritage in 2001. Shawwater's book, Inventing Herself, which was published in 2001, is a survey of feminist icons. And it seems to be the culmination of a long-time interest in communicating the importance of understanding feminist tradition. Shawwater's early essays and editorial work in the late 1970s and 1980s survey the history of feminist tradition within the wilderness of literary theory and criticism. Working in the field of feminist literary theory and criticism, which was just emerging as a serious scholarly pursuit in universities in 1970s, Shawwater's writings reflect a conscious effort to convey the importance of mapping her discipline's past in order to both ground it in substantiative theory and amass a knowledge base that will be able to inform a path for future academic pursuit. Now, she is concerned by the stereotypes of feminism that see feminist critics as being obsessed with the phallus. We have studied that in Freud, methodology of literature. Freud stated that women had this penis, or the feminist writers had suffered from penis envy. Remember phallus in methodology of literature when you studied Freud and Lacan psychoanalytic theory. So that is the reason as to why they tend to be writing or trying to portray themselves as victims. So she is also concerned by this sort of attitude, and also the writers, the male writers, who asserts that the female writers are always obsessed with destroying male artists. According to her, such a thing does not exist. Feminist writers or feminist critics only want a space of their own. They are not interested in destroying the male artists, nor are they or do they have any sort of envy on not being a man. Shawwater wonders if such stereotypes emerge from the fact that feminism lacks a fully articulated theory. Another problem for Shawwater is the way in which feminists turn away from theory as a result of the attitudes of some male academics. Theory is their property. That is what the male or what men or male critics state. And therefore, we feminists, or the feminist writers or the feminist critics, they do not have a theory of their own. They do not have a framework of their own. It is always considered as the man's property, the framework for how theories are to be written, how theories are to be concentrated, are all according to men, their property. Shawwater writes, let me quote, "From this perspective, the academic demand for theory can only be heard as a threat to the feminist need for authenticity, and the visitor looking for a formula that he or she can take away without personal encounter is not welcome." Unquote. In response, Shawwater wants to outline a poetics of feminist criticism. So let's begin the essay. This was just an introduction. This essay in Toward for Feminist Poetics is divided into two sections. Women as a reader or feminist critique, and women as a writer or gynocritics, la gynocritique. Okay, so first section we have women as a reader, you and I, all women who reads the novels of another woman writer. The woman as a reader or the feminist critique. Okay, and the next section is the woman as a writer or gynocritics, la gynocritique in French. Now let's start with the woman as a reader. Shawwater begins by distinguishing between what she calls the feminist critique, which focuses on women as a reader, with woman as the consumer of a male-produced literature, woman reading man's novel or male-produced literature, and also gynocritics, which is concerned with woman as a writer, with woman as the producer of textual meaning. Feminist critique is essentially political and polemical, and is metaphorically similar to the Old Testament, looking for sins and errors of the past. Gynocritics, according to Shawwater, is more self-contained and experimental. And to extend the earlier metaphor is like New Testament seeking the grace of imagination. Shawwater provides an exemplary feminist critique of Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge to demonstrate that one of the problems of the feminist critique is that it is male-centered or male-oriented, meaning in some sense, every feminist critique, even when criticizing patriarchy, is focused toward the male. As an alternative, Shawwater presents gynocritics as the way to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature and develop new models based on the study of female experience rather than to adapt the male models and theories. So what we have is the male framework of how a work is to be judged. We do not have a female framework, or we do have women writers, but we do not have a theory. We do not have a framework in which we can judge the work of literature. We often criticize patriarchy, but still we are we are in fact subjugated by them, and we are in fact focused towards the male acceptance, or we are focused towards how they use the tool that they have invented, the men have invented, the male critics have invented, and they kind of see it from that angle, or they analyze the work of a feminist writer from a male framework or a male-centered rules and regulations, and therefore the beauty of the text is never appreciated. So what Elaine Shawwater states is that we need to have theories. She is angry, or she is agitated by the fact that women turn away from theory. They are writers, of course. They write novels, they write short stories, but we do not have writers when it comes to making theories. We need a framework, and that is how gynocriticism or gynocritics is born. To begin to trace out this radically female-centered theory, Shawwater notes excerpts from feminist historians and sociologists. She then moves on to engaging discussions of the experiences of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and other female authors to show the need for completeness in discussing women authors' work, in which it is necessary to leave oneself room to deal with other things beside women's writers' work, so much that the work has been influenced by. This does not mean that the goal of the gynocritics is to erase the differences between male and female writing. Gynocritics is not on a pilgrimage to the promised land in which gender would lose its power, in which all texts would be sexless and equal like angels. Rather, gynocritics aims to understand the specificity of women's writing not as a product of sexism, but as a fundamental aspect of female reality. Its prime concern is to see woman as a producer of textual learning with history, themes, genres, and structure of literature by women. Its subjects include psychodynamics of female creativity. It studies linguistics and problems of female language in literary text. It reviews the trajectory of the individual or collective female literary career. It proposes to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature, to develop new models based on women's experience. Its study focuses on the newly visible world of female culture. It projects how feminine values penetrate and undermine the masculine systems that contain them. And at its extreme, it is engaged in the myths of Amazons and the fantasies of separate female society. Shawwater acknowledges the difficulty of defining the unique difference of women's writing, which she says is, quote, a slippery and a demanding task, unquote, in Feminist Criticism in the Wilderness, in her book. She says that gynocritics may never succeed in understanding the special differences of women's writing or realize a distinct female literary tradition. But with grounding in theory and historical research, Shawwater sees gynocriticism as a way to learn something solid, enduring, and real about the relation of women to literary culture. Shawwater then provides an exemplary feminist critique of Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge to demonstrate that one of the problems of the feminist critique is that it is male-oriented, meaning, in some sense, every feminist critique, even when criticizing patriarchy, is focused towards male. As an alternative, Shawwater presents gynocritics as the way to construct a female framework for the analysis of women's literature, to develop new models based on the study of female experience rather than to adapt male models and theories. She begins this by tracing out this radically female-centered theory. She goes right to the experiences of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and other female authors to show the need for completeness in discussing women authors and how it is necessary for oneself to leave their comfort zone and to deal with other things. Women writers, they work so much that the work has been influenced by conditions that have nothing whatsoever to do with the art. So she is in fact bringing in the necessity of creating a theory for women. All right? Because women tend to turn away from theory because they are normally male-centered. Again, she goes into bringing specify the three phases: the feminine phase, the feminist phase, and the female phase. So, from these experiences, Shawwater gives a rough sketch of the elements that have characterized women's writing: the awakening, the suffering, the unhappiness, and the matrophobia, among others. She concludes with her classification of women's writing into three phases, as I told before, that establishes the continuity of female tradition from decade to decade rather than from great woman to great woman. Shawwater traces the history of women's literature, suggesting that it can be divided into three phases. The feminine phase. Let's start with the feminine phase first. 1840 to 1880. Shawwater sees the first phase taking place from roughly 1840 to 1880. She calls this the feminine phase. And she declares that it is characterized by women writing in an effort to equal the intellectual achievements of the male culture. The distinguishing sign of this period is male pseudonym. And this exerts an irregular pressure on the narrative, affecting the tone, the diction, the structure, and characterization. You have seen many writers writing female writers using the male pseudonym because they were suppressing their female tradition, and they were trying to equal the intellectual achievements of male culture, and they brought in male pseudonyms, like for instance George Eliot. You have George Eliot is none other than Mary Ann Evans. So many of them used the male pseudonym, and they were trying to equal the intellectual achievements of male culture. Next phase is the feminist phase that begins from 1880 to 1920. That is, you have the women's suffrage. movement in US. The second feminist phase, wherein women are historically enabled to reject the accommodating postures of femininity and to use literature to dramatize the ordeals of wronged womanhood. This phase is characterized by Amazon utopias, visions of perfect female-led societies of the future. This phase was characterized by women's writing that protested against male standards and values, and this advocated women's rights and values, including a demand for autonomy, freedom. Okay, and then we have the female phase. The female phase is the one from 1920 to the present age, and this is one of self-discovery. Shawwater says, quote, women reject both imitation and protest. According to Shawwater, there are two forms of dependency. So, women reject both imitation and protest, two forms of dependency, and turn instead to female experience as a source of an autonomous art, extending the feminist analysis of culture to the forms and techniques of literature, unquote. Significantly, Shawwater does not offer a characteristic sign or figure for the female phase, suggesting a welcome diversity of experience that is too broad to be encompassed into a single image. So, rejecting both imitation and protest, Shawwater advocates approaching feminist criticism from a cultural perspective in the current female phase, rather than from the perspectives that traditionally come from an androcentric perspective like psychoanalytic or biological theories, for example. Feminists in the past have worked within this tradition by revising and criticizing female representation or lack of thereof, lack of it in the male tradition. Especially you will find that in feminine and feminist phases. These feminists the ones who worked in the past, they would criticize how females were represented in male tradition or male culture or their work written by men. That is in the feminine and the feminist phase. But that doesn't happen in the female phase, in the third phase. In her essay, Feminist Criticism in the Wilderness in 1981, Shawwater says, a cultural theory acknowledges that there are important differences between women as a writer, class, race, nationality, and history are literary determinants as significant as gender. Nonetheless, women's culture forms a collective experience within the cultural whole, an experience that binds women writers to each other over time and space, unquote. So in conclusion, on the whole, we may conclude that her views on feminist poetics are intelligent and largely devoid of rhetorical extremities, and it is confidently provocative. Shawwater speaks with a very convincing authority, and she firmly believes in what she is saying. She is both earnest in that she sees change needing to occur immediately, and she is also patient in that she expects that given time enough, the wisdom and truth of her course will prevail. So she wants critics to come forward. She wants feminist critics to come forward and create a framework where we can judge our own work. So that's about it. We have finished feminist toward a feminist poetics, and that's it with the semester. We have come to the end of our semester. So thank you for listening. Keep safe.